further ado, I want to introduce you to Larry, who's a member of the Dunbar Group.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning again. We have a lot of ground to cover today, and so we're going to do a little review or recap of what we talked about last night and moving to step 3. And step 3 is going to encapsulate probably the first half of the day. And last night we talked about the nature of the problem that Silkworth gave us, and that is a twofold problem. A problem that is the physical body and of the mental mind. And Silkworth says any description of the alcoholic that leaves out the body is incomplete. And what he talked about is the allergic reaction that alcohol has on people like us. And an allergy is an abnormal reaction to a food or chemical substance. And an obsession is an idea that overcomes all other ideas. It crowds everything out, any reason, any logic, any type of sane thinking that we may have. And because of this problem, it renders us powerless. And you know, the things that we do under the influence of alcohol is normal. You give anybody a toxic substance like alcohol, and they are going to get inebriated if they get enough. So what we do while we're under influence is not abnormal. That's normal. But what we do before in having this condition is not normal. And that is the thinking preceding the drink. Our book says we're strangely insane. You know, the DSM-3 or 4, they have different types of descriptions for different forms of what they call insanity. But we are a lot that we baffle the physicians. They don't understand us. And if they don't understand us, then it lends itself to we should be the one that completely and totally understand why it is that we can't drink and why it is that we cannot stop or quit entirely on our own. So therefore, when we look at the problem of the body through this allergy, and it says that this allergy is one of such that produces a phenomenon of craving. And a phenomenon is something that cannot be understood by the finite senses. You can see it, but you can't explain it. And that's why people say, that's a phenomenon. You know, you can't explain it, but it's there. And that's what Silkworth says. This is a phenomenon of craving. And it's something that you can't see. It's only something that you can feel. That's why when you look around the room and you look at your neighbors, we don't look like alcoholics. We look like normal people. Oh, but introduced to drink, I dare say the council house will be topsy-turvy. And what throws people off is this. Silkworth explains it, how alcohol affects people, 5 types of alcoholics. We give each one of us a drink of alcohol. One of us may become Don Juan. Another one may become Adonis. One of us may become Dr. Jekyll. Another one may become Mr. Hyde. Someone may crawl up on the table and want to make love. And one of us may want to be completely and totally depressed and crying in our beer. But Silkworth says no matter how it affects us like that, there's two things that we all have in common. And that's the fact that once we take a drink, we cannot control the amount we drink. And when we really, really, really try to quit on our own, that we find out that we cannot quit. And our book says that we have passed into a region that we're beyond human aid. And I think we're all human. So therefore, looking at this particular part of the problem that renders us powerless, this part of the solution, which we talked about last night, is obviously power. And we talked about this power being twofold. A fellowship, which is one part of the glue, and a program, which is the other part. Now it takes those two together. Bill, if you pay attention to the handout that was given to you, the blue handout, if you look at the goal one, the goal one is the doctor's opinion and Bill's story. We read that last night, the ABCs. A, that you're an alcoholic and cannot manage your own life. That B, probably no human power can relieve us of our alcoholism. And C, that God could, if he was sought. And we look at goal 2, and Bill writes 3 chapters that encapsulates step 2. He talks about how we believe, and he talks about power, and he talks about how we use our belief. And he also goes along with writing a complete and total chapter, which I think is one of the greatest writings that he's done, along with the chapter in the 12 and 12 on the instincts, about we agnostics. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. You see, our belief is the strongest thing that we have. That's the strongest power that man has, is his belief. We can use our belief for us, or you can use it against us. And Bill talks about the forms of, or the analogies of believing when he talks about how Columbus used his belief, how the Wright brothers used their belief. And you know, our belief is something that it's no more than a suspicion. It's all we have. It's upfront information. It's flimsy, but that's all we have. We do not know the results of our belief until we take action on our belief. We can believe a thing, but until we actually act on our belief and either get some results or not get the results, we do not know whether our belief is accurate. So Bill writes these 2 chapters. There is a solution, which is this power. Then he writes again more about alcoholism. And then he writes on the chapter, we agnostics. Have you ever asked yourself why he didn't write to the atheists? We're going to talk a little bit about that this morning, because I fully recognize when we talk about things like power, spiritual experience, God of our understanding, higher power, the word God, period, it lends itself to a lot of debate, confusion, or just outright denial. But hopefully, with whom I believe help, that I can sort of level the ground a little bit and at the very least, invoke some thought. As I always talk about, our minds are marvelous mechanisms, but we can only think or we can only feel. We can't do the two at the same time without fragmented thinking. And you know, the mind is like a parachute. It works best when it's open. A closed parachute and a closed mind will not do you any good. And that's all we're going to ask is just keep an open mind. There's a possibility. So we start off, we read page 45 last night, and now we're going to move to page 55, which is we agnostics. Because what we're rendered ourselves to, it says, believe in a power greater than ourselves. And I made the statement last night hoping to invoke some type of debate or thought when I said that God could not be a doorknob or a tree. It had to be something with intellect. And hopefully, I can at least correlate and back up what I'm saying so I can sort of clear the ground a little bit with someone who may have a little bit of opposition with that. You see, when we talk about the word God, if you would look in your dictionary, most definitions in the dictionary is going to lend itself to something like a spiritual being or a deity or a spirit of the universe or nature or something of the sort. Only one of two definitions in the dictionary is going to lend itself to anything even remotely related to religion. Because God is not religion. Religion is man-made. Religion is man's approach to God. And spirituality is God's approach to man. See, we cannot attain to spirit. We can't see it, taste it, touch it, hear it, or feel it. But we're rendered to the fact that we have to find a power greater than ourselves and or a God of our own understanding. So we have the ability to understand spirit. But we have to commune spirit to spirit. In actuality, that is the purpose of this book, is for us to achieve a spiritual awakening. You know, when you're thinking about this, also a little sidebar, a little digression. None of you all will never know what I believe other than the fact that I believe in a power greater than myself. It would be disingenuous for me to try to push my belief on you. Our book says we have to be willing to believe or become willing to believe. It doesn't say that you have to believe a particular way. It's just that you have to be willing to use your belief. And hence, since it didn't work for you before, obviously it's got to be a little different than you're using it before. So, when we think about this process that we have to go through to achieve a spiritual experience or a spiritual awakening, it is one of such that Bill masterfully writes about. And he goes on page 55, he says, actually we were fooling ourselves. And here's one more thing I want to throw in while I'm thinking about that. You see, this world and the people who live in it, it appears that we are physical beings looking for a spiritual experience. But in actuality, we're spiritual beings going through a physical experience. Because at some point in time, we all are going to have to take off this coat of flesh. There is an expiration date to everything you see. And the only time that we really come to grips with that is when we go to a funeral. And we see the body laying there, and they say that he or she is gone. But you're looking at a physical body. So that is not gone. What are they talking about that's gone? The spirit in the body. And then it returns to spirit. So Bill says, actually we were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is a fundamental idea of God. Ideas come from here, our brain. Some people think that God is here, so God knows my heart. But when we consider that, we're only talking about a muscle. This is a muscle. And when you think about and look at one of the definitions of heart, it means center. And we're talking about here in man's mind. Case in point. Legalities and science proves that one can have a heart transplant, a liver transplant, any type of organ transplant. But we haven't seen anybody yet that can transplant this thing here. And also, the law says you can stop your heart from beating and they can bring you back, but you're not truly dead. But when the activity cease and desist up here, that's when they call you legally dead. So there's some merit to what we're talking about. I may say some things that you may disagree. I may say some things you may totally, completely deny, and that's okay. But what I am talking about, and I'm attempting to do, is talk about spiritual principles. And spiritual principles are one of such that does not change. Such as, who set the standard for the average body temperature? I don't know what it is in Celsius, but in Fahrenheit it's approximately 98.6. That is worldwide. Who set the standard for water freezing? Makes no difference whether you're in the Mojave Desert, on top of Mount Fuji or Mount Everest, water is going to freeze at particular degrees and also boil. Here's another thing. Who and what had the intellect to set the standard, no matter what part of the world that you live in, what ethnic background you're from, what sex you are, what race you are? There's 4 types of blood. How blood can interchange. You think a doorknob or a tree could do that? Here's another thing. Science proves today that there's something that's called DNA. Now you gotta bear with me. I'm not a scientist, so I may mispronounce this. but it's called deoxyribonucleic acid. And the nucleic part is the part that we're going to highlight a little bit because it comes from the word nucleus. That means that my friend here, Peter, can come from 23 chromosomes from his mom, 23 from his dad, 43 chromosomes, and he has his own DNA, and he has 2 siblings, 2 brothers, but yet they come from the same 46 chromosomes, but have their same exact chromosomes, but a little bit of different DNA. So they have a source by which they come from. Science proves that. Here's the kicker to it. Not only do they come from the same chromosomes and the same strand of DNA, but they got that difference. So what that means is that whatever this power is, has the ability to identify and took time out for each and every one of us in the room. Didn't just happen by some. As a matter of fact, all people that's in the World Trade Center, and I'm still talking about our belief, how we believe and about this power, because Bill goes through a great chapter talking about the prosaic steel girder and what we believe and how we use our belief. I'm just trying to make light of a very possibly complicated subject and just invoked a little thought in how we look at this thing. Because DNA is the only way that they use to identify all those people in the World Trade Towers, through their DNA. They had to have a source by which those corpses came from that they could identify them. So what we're talking about is what Bill writes here, the fundamental idea of God. It says it may be obscured by calamity, confusion, chaos, by pomp, by ego, or by pride, or by worship of other things. Now, another definition of God is anything that we deem worthy of worship. And in our case, that was me. I worshiped me. Because I didn't know anything about anybody else's type of God. I surely didn't have one of my own. I just believed that there was, but I didn't know anything about it. So I was the closest and the thing that I worshiped. And Bill is going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about that when we get to step 3. So when we worship other things like cars, jewelry, clothing, whatever it is, that's what has obscured our understanding in regards to something greater than ourselves. So he goes on to say, but in some form or another, it is there. So if it's obscured by pomp, it's obscured by calamity, and it's obscured by worship of other things, but in some form or other, it is there. Well, what form is he talking about? Form of spirit. You see, each and every one of us right now, as we sit here, we have something that is called the breath of life. That's what causes us to breathe and pump blood. And the breath of life lends itself also, one of the definitions, lends itself to soul. So that means that we have spirit, soul, and body, the breath of life. And it is our challenge to tap into what Bill calls an inner resource of power. We spend millions looking out among the sun, moon, and stars. Matter of fact, too, that's why the Hubble telescope is out there, mapping the universe. But you know, he's closest to us here. You know, this great power could have said something like this. I could place myself out in the universe and I could place myself to the depths of the ocean, and men would try to search me out. But I'm going to place myself somewhere he would never, ever, ever look. Right under his nose within himself. We'll never look there. So Bill writes this chapter, and he says, for faith in a power greater than ourselves, and miraculous demonstration of that power in human lives, are facts as old as man himself. So we look at this process here. This is a fact we know about, and this is a fact that we guess about. Question mark. Facts. Two facts established. And that's all step 1 and 2 is statements of the facts. And I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm going to come back because when we look at step 3, when it says made a decision, we're talking about making a decision on the facts. That's what it says last night. We're alcoholic, we could not manage our life. No human power can. God could and would as he was sought. If we're convinced on those issues, you're then at step 3, which is make a decision. A decision is choose a course of action. Cut the facts in two. We either live over here and through death and insanity, or we can live over here and accept spiritual help and recovery. Our book says that's our dilemma. And the dilemma is a choice between two unpopular decisions. Neither one of them looks good, but you must choose one. We had a chap about 4 years ago that was rock climbing alone and by himself. And he fell between two huge rocks. And he was there alone, and he was wedged his arm between the rocks. And he cried out, and no one heard him because he was by himself. And his solution was to take his knife and jab around the rocks to try to free himself. That was his first solution. But it did not work. The ultimate dilemma that he had was either to stay in the rock and die or to cut his arm off. That was the dilemma he had, to either live or die. But he didn't want to cut his arm off, so the very knife that he had to ultimately use to cut his arm off, he dug, chipping that rock away. Made it worse. But ultimately, when they interviewed him, he described vividly about what he had to do, about how he was cutting through his flesh and his muscles and his tendons. And the last thing he had to cut was, he described the nerve as looked like a little piece of spaghetti. And he said when he cut through the nerve, it was excruciating pain. And then he had to break his bone. Now, even explaining that, when he said he broke his bone, he fell free. And this is what his statement was. I was reborn again. And he told about his experience on television. Now, one would sit here and just listen to that. There was no way, no how that this gentleman could perform that operation on himself without anesthesia, without some type of divine help. Would have passed out. A couple other little things while I think about it. Let me throw in while I'm thinking about it. You know, people say we can't make broad statements, but I am going to venture and make this one. I guarantee that everybody is sitting in this room at this time, at this second, has experienced what I'm going to say. Everybody. And that is, we have been in a situation at some point in some time in our life, whereas we should have experienced misfortune or even death. And we were there alone and by ourselves, and for some reason, we escaped both, and the only thing we said is, whew, that was close. What did that? Who caused you to pass misfortune, or what caused you? And you knew that you didn't do it. Everybody in here has had that experience. How can I say that? I'm not that great or not that smart, but I do know about this power. Because when we live and operate in a physical realm through a spiritual experience that we're not aware of, conscious of, that also lends itself to this, the second thing. We're people who want to be unique. You don't understand how I feel. As if something happens to one of us individually that does not happen to anybody else. That's one right there that you can't argue with. So if it happens to one, you can bet 5 to 10 will get you 10 that it probably happened to someone else. So Bill writes this chapter to the agnostic, just a little bit to kind of preface as we move along. He says, these are facts as old as man himself, and we finally saw that faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup, just as much as the feeling we have for a friend. Sometimes we had to search fearlessly, but he was there. He was much of a fact as we were. Now here's the part. We found the great reality off among the sun, moon, and stars. Of course not. We found the great reality in church. Of course not. He says we found the great reality deep down within us. And here's the other thing. When you kind of understand how Bill writes, he says, in the last analysis, it was only there, denotes singularity. That's the only, if you're going to find God, it's going to be within you. Oh, sure, he's manifest through a lot of things, but we're talking about in regards to something that we can understand. You see, our book also talks about the 5 finite senses, but then it talks about our vital 6th sense. And our 6th sense is our ability to understand. You know, I had a problem with other people's understanding, but I never had a problem with my own. Simple case in point. Most people in here can drive a motor or ride a bicycle. And how we attempted to do that was on our own understanding. And if you've ever tried to teach anybody to drive, believe me, you see driving, riding a bicycle, and tying your shoes are three of the most difficult tasks that a human being has to learn, because it requires cognitive and motion skills at the same time. You have to think and move your hands at the same time. In other words, walk and chew gum. And you know, you can sit down and teach your child how to tie their shoes, and they're looking at it. They seem like they just don't get it. Because they got to think and move at the same time. Same way with driving a motor. The same way with riding a bicycle. And you know, our first belief, we think we can do that. We can do that. But when we start off, and we ease up off the clutch, it goes dead. Now you know what? That first form of belief didn't work. But we make adjustment in our belief. And you're trying to give it gasoline and come up off the clutch and shift it to, and you all more than us, because most of your cars over here are manual. We got automatics. So you still have to render yourself to having to learn a very complicated task. And no one in here drives the same way you drive with your own understanding. And it's a simple way of how each and every one of us can use our own understanding to achieve a complicated task. So Bill writes, in the last analysis is only there that he may be found. We can only clear the ground a bit if our testimony helps sweep away prejudice, enable you to think honestly. That's all we want you to do, is just keep an open mind, think honestly. Encourage you to search diligently within yourself. If you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. With this attitude, you cannot fail. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. So Bill talks about the power greater than ourselves, how we believe, what we believe, and he also writes, also in this chapter, about why man has achieved such progress in the material world in the last 100 years, and why we have not achieved such progress in the spiritual realm. You know, even today as we sit here, we as human beings, we are quick and ready to grasp the newest and the latest gadget, hence the mobile phone. And most of us here can remember when there was no such thing. But because of its convenience, we think today that we can't live without it. You know, I can remember Star Trek when they had the little deal. Beam me up, Scotty. And now we have such things. Why is it that we grasp things like that readily, and yet when it comes to something spiritual, we say, oh no, it's not true. We're quick to get rid of that, cast that to the side. And with all the technology that we have today, we're still grappling with human problems, like the one we have. Alcoholism, cancer. And everything that we are working toward today is moving us into what we're going to talk about now. That's step 3. because we're looking at the dilemma. We're at the turning point where it says, made a decision, split the facts in two, to turn our will, which Bill says, our thinking, and our lives, which is our action, over to the original version says the care. You know, some people say, well, I don't want to be a non-entity. Well, we're talking about the care. When something happens to your motor, you have no problem taking it to the mechanic and putting it under his care. You're not leaving it there for him to keep it. You're just putting it under his care, the person who knows about it, to fix it and give it back to us and work in order. And what he does is he fixes it and says, I will warranty or guarantee this working properly if you use it by these directions. I will guarantee it for 30, 60, 90 days. And if you have a brand new one, they got a set of directions in, I don't know what your glove box, I guess, that says this is how you operate this motor. And then they said we're going to warranty this motor for such and such a time if you operate it by this way. Well, when we look at turn our will, which is our thinking, and our lives, which are our actions, over to the care and direction of God or our understanding. This is what Bill writes about it. Page 60. After we go through the ABCs, the description of the alcoholic, chapter to the agnostic, our personal adventures before and after, make clear three pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. That B, probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. And C, God could and would if he was sought. Then he says, being convinced, we were at step 3. And like I said last night, the old version says, if you're not convinced to this point, you need to reread the book or else throw it away. There's no reason trying to go forward if you're not convinced of these vital issues. And then it says, which is, we decide to turn our will, which is our thinking, and our life, which is our actions, over to God as we understood him. Now there's two very pertinent questions that he asks the reader. Just what do we mean by that, and what do we do? And I will admit that in my first years of sobriety, I didn't understand what he was talking about. And I actually did it because I followed the directions of a sponsor, but I didn't know that I was doing that. The only thing that I knew is that my life was in jeopardy and I had to follow somebody else's direction. And in the beginning, I can look back now, my sponsor was my God, because he was the person that I saw something in that I wanted, and I saw some things in him that I wanted to achieve, and I saw him demonstrating the very principles that he was asking me to follow. So a friend of mine and Joe's, he's gone on now, one of our friends, his name is Lloyd B., and he said, I needed God in a body. You see, I had never seen God before. So I needed something that I could see and relate to with my 5 finite senses. Case in point, when we look at each other in the room and we talk about attributes like love and beauty and power and wisdom, we need a shape and a form to attach that to. You see, it's abstract. Now, one could say wisdom, and we would think of what? Or let's put it like this. We could say intellect, and immediately some of us would think Einstein. Or we could say beauty, and we would think of some pop star, movie star. So you're going to attach a form to that abstract principle. So when we're talking about power, let me throw this in while I'm at it. We are people that readily try to give whatever power that we have to others. Do you recognize that no human being has power over you? The only thing they have is authority. Because at the very point that we think, and I'm saying this because we think about bosses, spouses, about how much power that we give them. But you know, at the very moment that we're having a problem with the boss, something happens, he gets sacked, he dies, he moves out of the way. What happened to the power then? The only one that has true power, it says the one who has all power and all knowledge. The only thing we have is authority to do certain things. And when you look at that, no man has power over the Spirit. So we look at this in this book, and we are under the guise of what do we mean by turning our will over, and how do we do it? That's a real intelligent question that you can ask yourself or ask somebody. And then it says the first requirement is that we be convinced that any life run on self-will, not just the alcoholic's life. Remember we talked about the alcoholic is an extreme case of self-will run riot, although he usually doesn't think so. But Bill says any life that's run on self-will could hardly be a success. On that basis, we're almost always in collision with something or somebody, even though our motives are good. And that's why it renders us over in 6 and 7 where it says, turn the good and the bad over. Because most of the time, our motives are based on self. Self-thinking, that's what self-will is. And Bill talks about step 3, which is, if you look at your handout, is the beginning of recovery. Not the beginning of action, but the beginning of recovery. Because that's when we make the decision to recover is in step 3. And it says it could have little or permanent effect unless at once carried out by action. So when we make the decision in step 3, we have to understand what is asked of us to do. Now he goes on through the previous pages and talks about the actor to explain the virtues of self-will. Now he says our actor may be quite virtuous, angry, indignant, but now when you think of it, about a play, who gives the directions in the play or the movie? Do the actor do them or do the director? Of course, the director is the one. But in this case, the actor is trying to run the whole show. He says, each person is like an actor who wants to run the whole show and is forever trying to arrange the lights, the ballet, the scenery, and the rest of the players in his own way. If his arrangements only stay put, if only people would do as he wished, the show would be great. Everybody, including himself, would be pleased. Life would be wonderful. In trying to make these arrangements, our actor may be sometimes quite virtuous He may be kind, considerate, patient, generous, even modest and self-sacrificing. On the other hand, that's the part we don't want people to know. He may be mean, egotistical, selfish, and dishonest. But with most humans, he is more likely to have varied traits. Now, Bill uses this page and the previous pages to talk about self. I think that another piece of his inspired writings, which he got from Carl Jung, talking about self, he wrote on page 42 in the 12 and 12. You won't have that in your book unless you got 12 and 12. Mine is dual. I got a big book on 12 and 12 put together. But before we move to that, I have a little something for the newcomers. It says 12 promises for the beginners. The first promise, you will know your full name and address. Second promise, you will be able to shave yourself or put your makeup on wherever you please. Third promise, you will be able to dress and undress yourself. Fourth promise, you will know the town, the state, and the country you live in. Fifth promise, you will be able to find socks that match or nylons without runs. Sixth promise, you will be able to smoke without burning yourself, your clothes, or the furniture. 7, you will lose fear of food. 8, you will be able to walk a straight line and pass the drunk driving test. 9, you will spend less time in the bathroom and be able to brush your teeth without gagging. 10, you will lose fear of police cars. 11, you will be able to answer the door without having to look through the peephole. 12, you will realize what a hell of a mess you were and thank God or your higher power for AA. That's the 12th promise. So Bill wrote an extensive and more detailed explanation about what it is that we have to turn over and what self is. You see, self as defined in the English Oxford Dictionary and the American Heritage Dictionary as either instincts, desires, drives, motives, intent. So when we look at that, that means that whatever that caused us to get up this morning, and whatever intent and motive that we start off with, we are rendered, as is in the third step prayer, to turn that over, whatever that is. It says, even though our motives are good. So this is what Bill writes. He says, creation gave us instincts for a purpose. And the first thing we have to come to grips with is that, first of all, that we have to have a knowledge of what self is. If we don't know what self is, we don't know what to turn over. How can one do something that he doesn't know what it is or doesn't know how it operates? So Bill writes this to try to give an explanation of what self is and what it is we have to turn over. He says he gave us instincts for a purpose. Without them, we wouldn't be complete human beings. If men and women didn't exert themselves to be secure in their persons, made no effort to harvest food or construct shelter, there would be no survival. So obviously these instincts that he gave us was for survival. Then he goes on to say, if they did reproduce, the earth wouldn't be populated. If there was no social instinct, if men cared nothing for the society of one another, there would be no society. So these desires, now he actually pinpoints what they are for the sex relation, the material and emotional security, and for companionship are perfectly necessary and right, and surely God given. So that means that you have a sense of self, and that means that you have desires that are driven to be satisfied. And the thinking that goes along that's attached to these drives to be satisfied for our survival. That's what self is, our thinking pertaining to ourself. Now you know, I have a 7-year-old son, and looking at this correlation, when he came on the scene, he knew nothing of who he was or who I was. The only thing that he knew is that he was hungry, or he was sleepy, or he needed some stimuli, and he would cry. So it was incumbent upon me, the father, to give these things to him. Now, the moment that he recognized that he had self, didn't know what it was, but he knew he had it, then the whole world was centered around him and his wants. Not his needs, but his wants. Because his needs was provided for every day, but then he began to recognize things that he wanted. Action figure toys, watching things on the television, certain sweets, certain this, all of this, and self kicked in. Now to the contrary, me having a somewhat healthy sense of self and knowing what self was, it was my obligation to help him develop his sense of self. To say, no, you can't have this. This is what you do. This is when you do it. This is how you do it. But you know what? We said, I'm grown. Nobody tells me what to do. Because self-centeredness and selfishness is the root of all our problems. So Bill writes this complete and total chapter about what self is. And he goes on to say that they are perfectly right and surely God-given. We've been given something that we don't understand. We've been given something that we don't know how to use properly. Excuse me. He says, yet these instincts, so necessary for our existence, often far exceed the proper function. I don't know about over here, but we got a fad now that's in the States because of so many people has gotten so rich. They got a term now that they call $1 million tear downs. That means you buy a house worth $1 million and you tear it down and you build one. You buy one, there's one there for about 5,000 square feet, $1 million. You tear it down and you build one for about 50,000 square feet. That's excessive. The hell of it. And it's only about 3 or 4 people living in the house. And they got things, marble imported from Spain. I mean, just excessive. That's what they call it now, $1 million teardowns. They buy a house and build one that costs $25 million. Like the guy that was over WorldCom, Bernie Evans, serving time. He had a 48,000 square foot home. That's larger than this. That's excessive. And then we look at the things that we do as humans. Excessive things like lying and greed. You see, this self is so powerful. This is what Bill says about it. He says, yet these instincts, so necessary for our existence, often far exceed their proper function. Powerfully, blindly, that means they're more powerful than you. Blindly, that means that you cannot see them. And many times subtly, it means they trick you. And they drive us and dominate us and insist upon ruling our life. Our desires for sex, material and emotional security, and an important place in society often tyrannizes. When thus out of joints, man's natural desires cause him great trouble. Now look at the way that he writes. He says practically all the trouble that there is. That means from the little boy standing in the corner that took the biscuit, that you did not teach him how to lie, and you ask him, did you get the biscuit? And it's all around his mouth, and he goes, no, I didn't get it. Instincts. From the worst criminal you can think of is a case of misdirected instincts. That's why Bill says this. No human being, however good, is exempt from these troubles. Nearly every serious emotional problem can be seen. Now remember we talked about the emotional barometer, the unmanageability of lying. Why we lie uncontrollably. My mother used to tell me, son, you would rather lie on credit. And I'm standing here with the money in my hand to pay you to tell the truth. And it took me a while to sort of understand what she meant. We will tell a lie quicker than breathing. And to say that we want, even though we haven't verbalized it, we've already lied before we took the breath. I have never told a lie and didn't know I was lying. Never by mistakes. Ooh, I told a lie. No. They're premeditated. That's how subtle and powerful and blind we do. And then we justify and rationalize it. Now we're talking about a power that is something that we can't control. We'd like to, but we can't control that. So Bill goes on to say, when that happens, our great assets, the instincts, have turned into physical and mental liabilities. First, he talked about the emotional. Now he's talking about the physical and the mental liabilities because of this emotional barometer. So we have to turn this over to a power greater than us. There's no way, no how that we're ever going to be able to control a power that great. We have to be able to turn it over. Now I'm going to read this and then we're going to move off into looking at the chart. This is what he says. He says, step 4 is a vigorous and painstaking effort to discover what these liabilities in each of us have been and are. We want to find out exactly when and how, we want to find exactly how, when, and where our natural desires have warped us. We wish to look squarely at the unhappiness it has caused others and ourselves. Remember, any life run on self-will can hardly be a success. By discovering what our emotional deformities, there we go again, talking about the emotions, because when we are sober or dry, so to speak, we still have these emotions. And these emotions are deformed and warped. That's why we act out. We have no way to conform or discipline ourselves, especially since the drink is gone. So it says, by discovering what our emotional deformities are, we can move toward their correction. Now here's the part. Without a willing and persistent effort to do this, there can be little sobriety or commitment for us. Without a searching and fearless moral inventory, most of us have found that the faith which really works in daily living is still out of reach. It says, before tackling the inventory problem in detail, let us have a closer look what the basic problem is. See, our problem is not alcohol anymore. That is just the mitigating factor. That's the catalyst that get us here. That's gone. And if we work on these emotional deformities, guess what? This obsession is going to be gone. So this is the thing that brings us here all together, is this mitigating, prevalent, appearing to be the problem. But Bill tells us in the book over and over again, our alcohol was but a symptom of a deeper problem. Now we're talking about the exact nature of what our problem is. And then he goes on to say, simple examples. After the following, take on a world of meaning when we think about them. Let's take a closer look at what the problem is. Simple examples like the following take on a closer meaning when we think about them. Suppose a person places sex desires ahead of everything else. In such a case, this imperious urge. Oh, excuse me. This is page 43 of the 12 and 12 bills, right? This is still AA. We're talking about sex. Some people don't want to talk about that. They say my sex life is my own. I have the right to do that. Sure you do. As long as it's not harming someone else. As long as you're able to control it and be disciplined. So Bill writes about this. He says, suppose a person places sex desires ahead of everything else. In such a case, his imperious urge can destroy his chances for material and emotional security as well. Excuse me. And his standing in the community. We can ask MJ about that, about his sexual instinct. People misinterpret what the book says. The book says God alone can judge our sex situation, but it did not say that we wouldn't be judged by our behavior, because we judge people by their sexual behavior. And then it says, this imperious urge can destroy his chances for material and emotional security, as well as his standing in the community. Another may develop such an obsession for financial security that he wants to do nothing but hoard money. Going to the extreme, he can become a miser or even a recluse who denies himself both family and friends. Nor is the quest for security always expressed in the term of money, because we're talking about emotional security. Going to the extreme, he can be, nor is the quest for security always expressed in terms of money. How frequently we see a frightened human being determined to depend completely upon a stronger person for guidance and protection. This weak one, failing to meet the life's responsibility on his own resources, never grows up. Disillusionment and helplessness are his lot. In time, all his protectors either flee or die, and he's once more left alone and afraid. We have also seen men and women who go power mad and who devote themselves to attempting to rule their fellows. These people often throw to the winds every chance of legitimate security and a happy family life. Whenever a human being becomes a battleground for the instincts, there can be no peace. But this is not all of the danger. Every time a person imposes his instincts unreasonably upon others, unhappiness follows. If the pursuit of wealth tramples upon people who happen to be in the way, then anger, jealousy, and revenge are likely to be aroused. If sex runs riot, there's a similar uproar. Demands made on other people are too much attention, protection, and love can only invite domination or revulsion in the protectors themselves. Two emotions quite as unhealthy as the demands which evoke them. And let's talk about jealousy. But what Bill is talking about is going through and giving us a detail what we have to turn over in step 3. Right before we go to break, I want to bring your attention to the handout again that we have. And that's the page where it has the basic instincts of life to create self. Now some might say, and if you want to look at these, how Bill writes them, he writes about this also in the form of the inventory on page 64, 65. But under the social instincts, we have the characteristic of companionship, wanting to belong or to be accepted. All of us have the desire to want to be accepted and to want to belong. Now, as we sit here as a society, you see we have a social instinct, and without the social instinct, we would not survive as a society. That means that we have to be able to function and operate as a whole or as a unit. Same way in a family. Do you recognize how many people it took to construct this building? One man could not have did this alone. They had to be able to come together and work together. Do you recognize how many people it took for us to get dressed this morning? And we're quick to say, I'm self-existing, I'm self-supporting, I'm not hurting anybody but myself, nobody can tell me what to do, and we immediately exclude other people from our lives, and there's no way, no how that we could exist on the face of the earth alone and by ourselves. Take a little sidebar here. You go back to the book just for a second, because Bill talks about this self on page 60. And this is what he says about it. This is on page 62, second paragraph. Selfishness, self-centered, that we think is the root of our troubles, driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, self-pity. We step on the toes of our fellows and they retaliate. Sometimes they hurt us, seemingly without provocation. But we invariably find that sometime in the past we have made decisions based on self, which later placed us in a position to be hurt. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. Above everything, we alcoholics must. And when you look up the word must, that means absolutely. Must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. Here's the other part. And there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without his aid. My. That's a powerful desire that we have that drives us and dominates us, and we try to control that. He's the only thing that can control that and put it back in its proper perspective so it can function healthy. This is on page 62 in the big book. Making meetings will not, cannot rid you of self. Our object and the goal is to find a power greater than ourselves that could rid us of this. This is the first step of recovery. When a person makes this decision, now let's fast forward down to the last paragraph, because he's going to answer the two previous questions that he asked you. He said, well, no, I'm not going to skip this. And this I'm going to have to read on through for those of y'all who don't have a book. We can't get rid of self without his age. Many of us have moral and philosophical convictions galore, but we could not live up to them even though we would have liked to. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. Now this is the how and the why of it. Now he's answering those questions. How you do it and why you have to do it. This is the how and why of it. And he said, first of all, we had to quit playing God. It didn't work. We were trying to control and direct something that's stronger than all of us. And that's these basic instincts through our own thinking, self-thinking. There's no way, no how that we're going to be able to control or direct a power as great as these instincts. These instincts are so powerful, they're for our survival. They're survival for the social instincts. They're survival for security, which is material and emotional. And then there's survival for the sex instinct. You see, this power that we're talking about is one of such, has the power to create and has the power to reproduce. It's not by happenstance that we have that power. We have to reproduce our own species, our own children. We have to be able to create. Look at this marvelous creation in here. Where do we get that from? And we see other things like the Eiffel Tower. You see, that ability to create and reproduce had to come from a source that did not originate in us. And these instincts that are so powerful, this power attached a reward every time that we would fulfill one of the instincts. Now listen to what I'm saying. To fulfill the instincts, not satisfy. I'm picking and choosing my words carefully because these instincts can never be fully satisfied. We live our life trying to make the best and the social connection. Connecting. Once we connect to the right social level, or social person, we feel good temporarily. Until someone else comes along, or we see someone that we dislike, and they have the same social connection. You see, it's fleeting. The rewards that come by them are fleeting. The material security. When you first start off, we look at material security, and we're happy to get that first little piece of transportation. But then we see someone else, they have a new car, then we want one better. It's fleeting. And for those of us who lends itself to education as being something, you know, when you get your first degree, you feel good. Until you walk up to someone, or you walk in a room with a bunch of people that has a master's degree. It drops down. You can never satisfy. And then you scuffle and get that master's degree until you walk in a room with some PhDs. And we try to satisfy this. We're all sitting here now, and we're somewhat secure in our emotions. But mothers and fathers alike, if someone call you on your mobile and say something to the effect, little Johnny or little Joe or little Betty, that's all they have to say. They don't even have to give you the rest of it. Immediately your mind is going to think, what's wrong? And you're going to be emotionally insecure until they give you the rest of the facts. Briefly, about this sex instinct. See, each time we perform this instinct, there's a reward attached to it. But it's fleeting. And the sex instinct is one of such. Do you recognize how many times you would use your sex instinct if there's no reward attached to it? That's a lot of work. For 5, 10, 15, 20, how long you're physically able to perform it. That is a lot of work that you're going to do. And what you're looking for is a reward. And if you don't receive that reward, I dare say you won't use it again that often. Now the reward is so great to each and every one of the instincts, the social instinct, the security instinct, and the sex instincts. The reward is so great, and that's the problem. Because trying to seek the reward and trying to change how we feel by using the instincts and using outside methods like sex, like money, like position, like material security and houses. The reward is so great until we work and we run over people and we use people trying to get that reward over and over and over again. And the sex instinct is one of such that we harm people the deepest with. You can rob a person, you can even slap a person, but if you harm a person with the sex instinct, that is a deep emotional scar. And we treat that very lightly. A power that strong, and we treat it lightly. You see, the sex instinct, animals have the sex instinct. Now here it is again, we're going to talk a little bit about this power. You see, animals are controlled by what's called spirit law. Their senses are heightened. It is said that when the tsunami was about to happen, all the animals went to higher ground. What caused them to do that? Just last week in Hawaii, before the earthquake, all the dogs went to howling. And we're supposed to be the highest form of intelligence. Some friends of mine were playing golf, deer always ran across the golf course. And they would always run across when they saw the people, and they'd see them, they'd take out running. But this particular day, the deer ran out in the middle of the fairway, and they paused and they kneeled just about as far as I am here from Pauline. They paused on their knees and were still. And they said, man, look at there. I wonder what's wrong with the deer. Because other than that, they would run away. And they paused there. And about 2 minutes later, there was a tremor came. And after it was over, they jumped up and ran away. Now, why can't we be in tune with something like that? Because of pomp, calamity, and worship of other things. You know, an animal has a sex instinct. This power determines when they use it, how many times they use it, and moreover, what position they use it in. Us, we can use it whenever we want to, with whom we want to, how many times we want to, and whatever position we want to, and hence, that's the problem. Because we get to use it at the wrong place, wrong time, for the wrong reason, with the wrong person. You've never seen a cow or a dog on a psychologist's couch with a sex problem. You never heard them performing the act of rape. Think about that. They don't rape each other. They don't kill each other just for out of emotions. They may kill each other for territory or food, but they don't kill each other out of anger. But we got intellect. And we're supposed to be the highest form of intelligence. Why is it that we can't operate like the animals? Because of a thing called self. You see, the animal's self is controlled by a power greater than him at all times. But we have the ability of self-will. See, there's two wills. There's God's will and there's self-will. What we're looking at here, everything that you can see that has an expiration date here, is man's will. Man constructed everything that you see in here, except for if this planet, he didn't make that. He didn't make the trees. When you look outside, that's God's will. As a matter of fact, to the contrary, he made a cockroach before he made us. A snail, an ant, a mosquito. But this thing that we got called self is so out of whack, it causes us to believe a lie, even to the point it causes us to disbelieve of a power greater than us. One minute. This little watch here, this is a little Timex watch. There was a time in the States, this was a real cheap watch. This is just a mediocre watch now, but it's a chronograph. Timex. Matter of fact, it has a stopwatch and, 2 time zones. That's where I got it. I can press this in the United States time. It has pretty good little features. Illuminated dial, and, it's pretty neat. But you know what? You can say, man, that's a neat watch. But common sense, logic would tell you that the watch didn't make itself. Something greater than this made the watch. So something that you can't see, make the things that you can see. No matter how great you think the architect, or how great you think this building is, the architect is greater than the building. Because he formulated it out of his mind. Let's take a break. It's 11 o'clock. Come back sharp, 11:15. Thank you.